30 years of... I will not let our lives wash away. The boat cannot hold this iron, Arthur! Drop the box or we capsize!
Father, my eyes cannot see your gold, but my hands can feel you dying in the dark.
I let it go. I am coming home, Maeve.
Some people spend their entire lives believing that security is something you can lock inside an iron box and weigh upon a brass scale. They measure their worth by the debts others owe them, guarding every scrap of parchment as if paper could turn away the winter wind or buy back the heartbeat of someone already gone. If you have ever carried a burden so long that your fingers forgot how to open, step out onto the misted riverbank and listen to the water. 48 hours before the floodwaters crested, the Greywater River was only a grey ribbon winding quietly past the stone wharves of Oakhaven. Arthur Sterling sat behind his mahogany counter, his quill scratching steadily across the heavy vellum pages of his master ledger. The counting house smelled of old paper, sealing wax, and the damp cedar piles that held the foundation 3 feet above the river mud. On the shelves behind him stood rows of brass balance scales, locked iron deed boxes, and pawned heirloom silver wrapped in flannel cloths. For 30 years, every fisherman, timber rafter, and boat builder along the lower valley had passed through Arthur's door. When the winter freeze locked the barges in ice, Arthur provided flour and coal against the deed to an orchard. When a spring squall tore a sail, Arthur loaned silver against a grandfather's pocket watch. He was not a cruel man in his speech. He never raised his voice, and he never charged a penny beyond the signed contract. But he never forgave a single coin, and he never returned a token until the last copper was counted on his counter. In the small living quarters behind the shop, his 18-year-old daughter, Maeve, sat on a low wooden stool beside the hearth. Her fingers moved softly across a spinning lump of terracotta clay, shaping the rim of a small bowl by touch alone. An incurable fever 4 years earlier had begun clouding her vision, leaving her with only milky shadows and the faint memory of color. Yet her hands were steady, pressing delicate whorls into the damp earth with patient grace. Arthur looked up from his ledger, watching her unseeing eyes turn toward the crackling fire. A familiar knot tightened in his chest. 10 years ago, his wife had died in a drafty room because he could not afford the foreign apothecary's tincture. He had sworn over her cold hands that his daughter would never know the humiliation of want. "Another 500 silver pieces this autumn, Maeve," Arthur said softly, dipping his quill into the dark inkwell. "By spring, I will purchase the stone townhouse on High Street. You will have silk curtains, coal fires, and 3 servants to guide you." Maeve smiled faintly, wiping clay from her fingertips. "The stone house has high walls, Father," she murmured. "Will I still hear the river singing to the willows?" Arthur did not answer. He pressed his heavy brass seal into hot red wax, locking another promissory note into the book. Outside, far up in the northern mountains, the rain began to fall in unrelenting sheets. By dawn on Thursday, the grey water had turned from murky brown to churning yellow foam. Tree trunks, broken fence posts, and tangled brush raced southward on the swift current. The water level had already swallowed the lower stone steps of the pier, slapping against the massive oak piles beneath Arthur's shop with heavy, hollow thuds. The bell above the shop door jingled sharply as Barnaby Vance pushed his way inside, bringing a blast of wet wind and mist. Barnaby was a timber master whose family had floated cedar logs down the valley for 3 generations. Water dripped from his oiled wool coat onto the polished pine floorboards. His face was grey with fatigue, his dark eyes shadowed by worry. "Mr. Sterling," Barnaby said, leaning his heavy, calloused hands against the counter, "the upper levee at Willow Bend is crumbling. 24 families are stacking gravel bags on the north embankment right now. If the embankment fails before noon, the lower quarter will be completely submerged." Arthur did not look up from his column of numbers. He neatly blotted a fresh entry before setting his brass ruler in place. "I am aware of the river gauge, Barnaby," Arthur replied in his dry, measured cadence. "The municipality has its own emergency fund." "The town hall is flooded, Arthur," Barnaby pleaded, stepping closer. "The gravel yard will not release 3 barge loads of crushed stone without payment in hand. I need my father's carved jade seal, the one I left with you last spring, as surety for the new saw blades. The quarry master will accept the seal as collateral for the stone." Arthur finally raised his eyes, adjusting his wire spectacles. "Your promissory note matures in 3 weeks, Barnaby," Arthur said evenly. "The outstanding balance is 74 silver pieces. When you bring 74 silver pieces, the jade seal will be placed into your hands, not 1 hour before." "Those gravel bags will save 40 homes, Arthur." Barnaby's voice rose, vibrating with suppressed fury. "Your own foundation sits on these river muds. If the dike breaches, your floor will be underwater before sunset. My building is engineered on 12-inch oak pilings driven deep into the bedrock," Arthur answered calmly, placing his hand flat upon the black leather ledger. "Contracts are the only bedrock that survive human panic. If I release your pledge without payment, every debtor from here to the sea will demand their collateral today. The rule stands." Barnaby stared at him for 5 long seconds, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white against his weathered skin. "May your gold keep you warm when the water reaches your throat, old man," Barnaby whispered bitterly. He turned and strode out into the howling storm, slamming the heavy cedar door behind him. Through the curtained doorway, Maeve walked into the shop with slow, deliberate steps. Her right hand trailed along the smooth mahogany counter until she reached her father's elbow. "Who was that, father?" she asked quietly. "A man who wishes to renegotiate terms because the sky is cloudy," Arthur said, opening the iron latch of his ledger. "Nothing for you to worry about, little one." Maeve reached out, her gentle fingertips brushing across the hard leather spine of the ledger, then moving up to touch the cold brass padlocks of the deed boxes. "His heart sounded like a broken oar striking stone," Maeve whispered. "Father, old Thomas told me while I was gathering rushes that the mountain dams have opened their spillways. The river is not just rising, it is hungry." "This house has weathered 40 floods, Maeve," Arthur said, his tone firm, though a dull ache pressed behind his temples. "Go pack your warm wool cloaks and the silver tea set your mother left. If the water enters the street, we will take the skiff to the high ridge." By 4 in the afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised slate. The river was no longer flowing, it was roaring. The muddy tide climbed over the wharf, pouring into the cobblestone streets of the lower quarter like a dark, unstoppable tide. Shouts of warning and church bells echoed across the valley. Old Fisher Thomas pulled his wooden skiff alongside the second-story window of the counting house, his single leg braced against the gunwale as the boat rocked on the swell. "Arthur, Maeve," the old fisherman shouted against the wind, banging his oar against the wooden shutters. "The north dike just collapsed. You have 10 minutes before the surge hits the wharves. Get into the boat now." Maeve stood by the open window, a small canvas sack over her shoulder, containing a single change of clothes and the small clay jar she had finished that morning. "Father, come," she called, her voice trembling in the damp air. "Thomas is here. Step out onto the sill." Arthur stood at the top of the cellar trap door in the middle of the shop floor. Beneath the heavy trapdoor lay the stone-lined vault where 30 years of accumulated wealth resided, 200 ounces of refined silver, 3 iron-bound deposit chests, and the master black leather ledger containing $40,000 in Valley promissory notes. "Go with Thomas, Maeve," Arthur shouted back, lighting a storm lantern with trembling hands. "Get into the skiff. I must secure the master chest and the mortgage deeds from the lower safe. I will follow you in 2 minutes." "Father, leave the chests," Maeve cried, reaching her hands into the empty air toward his voice. "The water is already under the floorboards. Please." 2 minutes, Maeve," Arthur yelled, descending into the dark, wet cellar steps. "Everything I built for your life is in this vault. I will not let 30 years of our lives wash out to sea." As his boots touched the cold water pooling in the cellar, a deafening crack echoed from beneath the foundation. Upstream, 3 miles away, 1,000 tons of mountain timber broke loose from the log booms, charging downstream toward the fragile wharves of Oakhaven. The first rogue log struck the outer corner of the foundation like a battering ram. The entire building shuddered violently. Overhead, porcelain dishes shattered on the floor, and the oil lantern swung in wild, terrifying arcs, casting frantic shadows across the flooding room. Arthur fell to his knees in 18 inches of freezing river water inside the vault. He scrambled toward the heavy oak shelf, his fingers frantic as he hauled the 80-pound iron chest onto his lap. The chest was cold, heavy with brass-cornered ledgers, gold tokens, and silver certificates. Water was pouring through the foundation stone seams in thick, brown gouts. He struggled up the wooden cellar stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When his head cleared the floor hatch, he gasped in horror. The grey water had smashed through the riverside bay windows. A waist-deep torrent was swirling through his counting house, tossing mahogany chairs, ledger desks, and balance scales into the corners like dry leaves. Floating promissory notes drifted on the dark surface like dead white moths. At the open second-story loading doors, Fisher Thomas was desperately trying to keep the skiff from being smashed against the wall. "Arthur, jump!" Thomas roared through the rain. "The central pilings are shearing. The house is going down." Maeve was kneeling in the bow of the boat, her hands clutching the wet gunwale, her unseeing eyes wide with terror as she leaned toward the sound of the rushing water. "Father," she screamed, her voice piercing the roar of the flood. "Father, where are you?" Arthur waded through the waist-deep current toward the loading sill, dragging the 80-pound iron chest with both arms. His back burned with agony. Every muscle in his 62-year-old body screamed under the dead weight of the iron box. In his teeth, he held the thin hemp cord tied to Maeve's unglazed clay jar, which had been resting on the high mantelpiece. He reached the window frame, water swirling around his chest. "Take the chest, Thomas," Arthur panted, his spectacles hanging off one ear, his hands bleeding from the iron handles. "Take the master chest first." Thomas leaned over the side of the rocking boat, grabbing the iron handle. As soon as the weight of the chest transferred to the skiff's gunwale, the small wooden boat tipped dangerously to port, water pouring over the wooden sideboards. "It is too heavy, Arthur," Thomas yelled, his face turning purple with strain. "The skiff cannot hold this metal, and 3 people in this current. It will swamp us. Drop the box." "No," Arthur roared, holding the handle with desperate fury. "This is $40,000 in Valley land deeds. It is Maeve's entire future. It is 30 years of my life." Another massive timber collided with the foundation beneath them. A terrifying sound of splitting wood echoed through the dark. The main supporting pillar of the counting house fractured with the sound of a cannon shot. The roof began to sag inward, showering heavy slate tiles into the water below. The force of the shifting floor threw Arthur backward into the swirling pool. The iron chest slipped from the boat's edge, plunging into the black water and dragging Arthur beneath the surface by the grip of his own stubborn hands. Cold, muddy water filled his mouth and nose. In the suffocating darkness beneath the surface, his boots kicked uselessly against the disintegrating floorboards. The iron chest was pulling him down into the silty riverbed like an anchor of stone. His lungs burned for air, yet even in the depths of that drowning dark, his fingers remained locked around the iron handle. If I let go, his mind screamed through the roaring silence, I am nothing. If I let go, 30 years of labor are gone. If I let go, I failed Clara. Then, through the churn of the current, a hand plunged into the water. It was a small, slender hand, searching blindly in the dark until its soft fingers touched Arthur's soaked wool sleeve. Maeve had leaned out over the tipping gunwale, her arm reaching into the freezing flood, her face wet with rain and tears. Her fingers found his wrist, slipping down to the rigid, white-knuckled fist, clutching the iron handle. She could not pull him up. She did not have the strength. Instead, her small palm simply rested over his clenched fingers, trembling violently in the cold. Arthur kicked upward, his head breaking the surface for a single, gasping second beside the boat. Through the rain, he saw his daughter's face inches from his own. Her clouded eyes were wide and filled with boundless sorrow, reflecting the grey fury of the sky. "Father," Maeve wept, her voice breaking against the storm. "My eyes cannot see your gold. My eyes cannot read your ledger, but my hands can feel you dying in the dark." The words struck through Arthur's chest, sharper than the winter frost. He looked down through the murky water at his own white knuckles. For 30 years, he had believed he was holding the gold to protect his child. In this terrible, blinding instant of truth, he saw the reality. The gold was holding him. The ledger was drowning him. The fear of losing paper had made him blind to the only living warmth left in his world. A massive beam groaned overhead, snapping in two. Arthur unlocked his fingers. He opened both hands completely, spreading his palms wide against the current. The 80-pound iron chest slipped away into the black depths of the Greywater River, sinking quietly into 30 feet of river mud without a sound. With his hands free, Arthur surged upward through the churning water. Fisher Thomas grabbed him by the collar of his soaked coat, while Maeve held his forearm with all the strength in her slender body. Together, with one desperate heave, they hauled Arthur over the wet wooden gunwale into the bottom of the skiff. A second later, the counting house collapsed. The 2-story stone and timber building folded inward with a thunderous roar, sliding into the raging river like a mountain of kindling. Waves of brown water washed over the skiff, pushing the little boat out into the open current. Thomas dug his oars deep into the water, fighting the swirl of the eddy, guiding the boat toward the high ground of the eastern ridge. Arthur lay on the slatted floor of the skiff, coughing up river water, his chest heaving with deep, shuddering breaths. Rain washed the silt and sweat from his forehead. His brass spectacles were gone, lost forever in the flood. The valley was dark, save for the flickering torches of villagers gathered on the safety of the stone ridge high above the water. Maeve knelt beside him in the bottom of the boat, pulling her dry wool shawl over his shivering shoulders. Her gentle hands moved across his wet face, checking his forehead, his cheeks, and the old crescent burn scar on his left thumb. When her fingers confirmed he was breathing, she buried her face in his soaked wool collar and wept silently. Arthur reached up with his trembling, empty hands. For 10 years, his palms had felt only the dry texture of parchment, the cold rim of silver coins, and the sharp edges of iron keys. Now, he felt only the soft, warm curve of his daughter's cheek, the gentle rise and fall of her breath, and the living beat of her heart against his chest. Beside them on the slatted seat of the boat, tucked safely inside the canvas sack, rested the small, sun-dried clay jar. It was unbroken. Arthur wrapped both arms around his daughter and closed his eyes. The river roared beneath them in the dark, but inside the little boat, the storm was finally over. By dawn on Friday, the clouds tore open, letting long shafts of pale amber sunlight spill across the flooded valley. The water had begun to recede, leaving behind vast plains of glistening river silt and quiet, glass-like pools reflecting the clear blue sky. Arthur sat on an overturned wooden crate along the high willow embankment, wearing a dry flannel coat given to him by the village weavers. Across the ridge, dozens of families were sharing warm bowls of barley porridge around communal campfires. Down below, at the water's edge, Barnaby Vance was directing a crew of timbermen repairing a stranded fishing barge. Arthur looked down at his own lap. In his hands, he held the small, unglazed clay jar Maeve had sculpted. The morning sun caught the rough terracotta surface, illuminating the delicate whorls of his daughter's fingerprints pressed permanently into the rim. Inside the jar stood 3 wild river reeds, their feathery tips glowing like spun gold in the fresh morning breeze. Maeve sat beside him on the grass, her face lifted toward the warmth of the rising sun, her hair catching the amber light. "Can you feel it, Father?" she asked softly, placing her hand gently over his. The warmth on the water. Arthur looked at the empty river, where his grand house and heavy ledgers had stood for 30 years. A deep, quiet smile touched the corners of his mouth. He took his daughter's hand and held it gently, leaving his fingers open to the morning light.